The apology never landed. Not on his heart, not on the moment, not on the story that was already spiraling beyond repair. The glass hit the wall before anyone even processed the motion, exploding into jagged stars that glittered like falling shrapnel. The sound was sharp, violent, intimate. The kind of sound that rewrites a room. "Don't you ever say my name again," Jungkook growled, voice low and trembling at the edges like a wire pulled too tight. His golden eyes, the ones that once carried galaxies of warmth, were now frozen constellations of something colder, something wounded, something unreachable. Jimin didn't step back, not this time. His hands were fists at his sides, crescent marks carved into his palms from nails that refused to unclench. He had come to say sorry, to own the words, to kneel before the truth if he had to. But Jungkook wouldn't even give him his gaze, and Taehyung, quiet, observant, immovable, stood in the center of the storm, shoulders squared, jaw set, carrying the weight of a story that wasn't just his to tell. The kind of weight that makes even breathing feel political. Outside the towering windows of HYBE's private lounge, rain streaked downward like the sky itself was in mourning. Thunder rolled slow and animalistic, like a warning spoken in a language older than words. The city was loud, but the lounge was louder in its silence. A silence thick enough to choke on, heavy enough to feel like a verdict delivered without trial. 3 weeks earlier, something had ignited. A spark, a betrayal, a fracture that no camera captured and no fan theory predicted. After the Tokyo Dome concert, behind a dressing room door sealed tighter than any vault, something had been said. Something had been heard. Something had been buried alive in the space between schedules and smiles. The world saw 7 untouchable icons, glowing under stadium suns, thriving in choreographed perfection. But Taehyung had seen the underbelly. The moments between moments. The unscripted seconds where truth leaks not through microphones, but through oxygen. Group dinners stopped first, then laughter, then sleep, then peace. Inside jokes turned into inside ghosts. Jimin stopped resting. Jungkook stopped speaking. Taehyung stopped intervening, not out of apathy but out of timing. He was watching, waiting, cataloging every crack in every armor, not to expose but to understand. Because the truth always comes out. The only question is who survives it. Jungkook poured himself into perfection like perfection was the only witness he trusted. Dance sessions bled into dawn. Vocals cracked into confessionals no one else heard. His feet blistered, his voice frayed, his heart, that was already bruised long before anyone noticed. Jimin tried everything, messages left on read, calls dissolving into voicemail voids, gifts returned unopened like peace offerings rejected at the border. Even his smile, the one that once softened Jungkook's pulse into poetry, now dissolved before impact, like snow falling into fire. Taehyung had seen Jimin asleep on the studio floor once, curled into himself like a note folded too many times. He could have woken him. He didn't, because waking someone too early doesn't save them. It just interrupts the breakdown. And Taehyung knew this story needed the breakdown to reach the breakthrough. Then came the red carpet moment. Cameras firing flashes like artillery. BTS arranged in immaculate formation. Tailored suits, tailored smiles, untailored pain. Even ARMY felt it. The micro shoulder shift away from Jimin. The glances that didn't land. The aura of a Cold War fought not in headlines but in muscle memory. But the real story didn't start until the cameras stopped rolling. It started backstage in the hallway shadows, where apologies don't get applause and pain doesn't get soft lighting. "Tell me why you did it," Jungkook demanded once, voice ricocheting like accusation and prayer intertwined. Jimin answered in fragments, in truths that felt incomplete, like honesty spoken without self-understanding is just a different form of lying. That was when Taehyung finally stepped forward, not loudly, not theatrically, but with a tone that made both of them snap their heads like they had forgotten he was even in the equation. "Enough," he said, one word, one strike, one narrative pivot, because the truth wasn't just about Jimin breaking Jungkook. It was about both of them letting something break inside themselves and calling it destiny. Karma had already entered the chat, not in fire, not in punishment, but in revelation waiting to detonate. And Taehyung, the man who carried the ending before anyone even knew the story, finally felt the clock tick forward. The story was ready to change hands. The silence was ready to break. The truth was ready to grow teeth. And the world had no idea that the most dangerous moment wasn't the glass shattering against the wall. The flashback hit before the explanation did. It always does. Pain has its own chronology, and memories never ask for permission before they storm the stage. 3 weeks earlier, Tokyo still smelled like sweat, confetti, and late-night ramen when everything split in half. The Tokyo Dome concert had ended in a roar of cheers, but the real concert, the private one, began only after the applause faded into history. The dressing room door clicked shut like a period at the end of a sentence no one wanted to write. Jungkook was still buzzing with adrenaline, towel over his shoulder, hair damp, microphone abandoned on the vanity like a sword sheathed after battle. Jimin stood near the wardrobe rack, unusually quiet, fingers grazing the fabric of a stage jacket as if the texture could ground him. Taehyung was there too, seated on the couch, scrolling his phone aimlessly. At least, that's what they thought he was doing. The room was calm until it was. Because calm in idle dorms is rarely peace, it's compression. A pressure cooker humming softly before someone twists the lid. Jungkook cracked a joke first. The kind of dumb, effortless humor that used to glue them together like duct tape over bullet holes. Jimin smiled faintly. A micro-expression. The kind that looks like warmth until you zoom in and realize it's fatigue wearing a mask. Jungkook noticed nothing. Taehyung noticed everything. And that's why Taehyung heard it when Jimin whispered to their manager, thinking the universe was muted. 6 words, 6 nails, 6 detonators. I never really meant any of it. The words weren't aimed at Taehyung. They weren't even aimed at Jungkook. They were aimed at himself, but shrapnel doesn't discriminate. It hits whoever's standing too close. Taehyung froze mid-scroll, his thumb hovering like a suspended breath. His heartbeat loud enough to qualify as evidence, even though his face stayed criminally neutral. He didn't interrupt, didn't gasp, didn't even blink in a way that would give him away. He simply archived the moment into memory because some truths don't need immediate reaction. They need incubation. They need time to curdle before they're understood. Later that night, Jimin spiraled inward. His phone screen glowed in the darkness like a lighthouse signaling distress, except no rescue boats were coming. He typed apology after apology, paragraphs collapsing into ellipses. The texts were read but unanswered. That was Jungkook's retaliation. Not violence, not confrontation, not theatrics, just silence sharpened into a weapon. Because in idol culture, silence isn't absence. It's punishment disguised as professionalism. Jungkook wasn't sleeping either. He was practicing. Obsessively. Choreography drilled into muscle, vocals drilled into bone, perfection drilled into a heart that was fraying like denim rubbed against asphalt. He wasn't practicing to improve. He was practicing to anesthetize. Because perfection is pain's favorite sedative when vulnerability feels illegal. Taehyung stayed the observer, the one in the corner, the one who watches the watchers. The one who hears the things no one intends to broadcast. He didn't expose Jimin. Not yet. Not because he was protecting him. Not because he was enabling him. But because he wanted to see whether Jimin would eventually confess the truth himself. Bravery delayed isn't bravery canceled. It's bravery being tested for authenticity. But authenticity in idle narratives is a rare gemstone. And pressure tends to reveal fractures faster than courage reveals honesty. The betrayal wasn't that Jimin said those words. The betrayal was that those words echoed a fear that had already existed between them, an unspoken anxiety that love was conditional, that attachment was transactional, that caring too loudly would summon abandonment. The real betrayal was the silence that followed the whisper, the silence that spread like black mold, the silence that no one dared disinfect, because idols don't get sick days, not for their lungs, not for their hearts, not for the pieces of themselves they accidentally shed backstage. And while the world was still watching the glitter, the stadium lights, the polished choreography and curated vulnerability, Taehyung was already holding the raw file, the unedited truth, the narrative key that could either unlock redemption or detonate reputations. What neither Jungkook nor Jimin realized yet was simple, terrifying, and narratively inevitable. The story wasn't about betrayal versus forgiveness. It was about who would speak first when the silence ran out. And Taehyung, he was almost out of patience. The leak didn't explode like a bomb. It slithered out like smoke through a crack in the floor, quiet at first, then everywhere at once. 3 seconds of muffled audio shouldn't have been enough to rewrite an empire built on perfection. But in the age of fandoms and digital wildfires, 3 seconds is more than enough. Because a spark doesn't need a speech. It only needs oxygen. The voice memo surfaced without ceremony, without context, without mercy, spreading across social platforms like spilled ink that no hand could wipe clean. The words were mangled by compression, warped by distance, but recognizable in their tone, recognizable in their damage. I never really meant any of it. Not screamed, not declared, whispered, the most dangerous volume of truth. Hashtags erupted, not unified, not organized, chaotic, accusatory, a courtroom without judge, jury, or closing statements. Fans dissected syllables like forensic analysts hunched over evidence bags. Reporters treated the leak like prophecy. Commentators built cathedrals out of speculation. And the narrative spun faster than any PR machinery could process. Jimin didn't vanish physically. Idols rarely get that luxury. He still showed up to rehearsals, to fittings, to choreography sessions. But he disappeared in the more culturally efficient way idols evaporate, by becoming scenery. A body with no presence. A face with no voice. A name that felt like a headline even when unspoken. Taehyung felt the shift immediately. He was used to reading rooms, atmospheres, the tension between breaths. But this time the tension wasn't interpersonal. It was architectural. The building itself felt like it was bracing for impact. Because once the public decides a villain exists, nuance becomes illegal, context becomes optional, and humanity becomes an inconvenience. Jungkook reacted differently, not by defending himself, not by defending Jimin, but by retreating into excellence like excellence could testify on his behalf. If silence was his first weapon, perfection was his second shield. He practiced harder, slept less, smiled less, felt less, or at least pretended to, because idols are trained early that emotions are liabilities unless choreographed for public consumption. But what Jungkook didn't understand yet was simple. The internet doesn't punish imperfection. It punishes inconsistency. And the world had begun to notice the inconsistencies. Taehyung saw it first in the practice footage fans were now reanalyzing. The micro-avoidance, the emotional negative space, the tension-coded posture, the way Jungkook's shoulder rotated away from Jimin like betrayal had rewired his skeletal system. The way Jimin stopped reaching out like a man who feared even contact lenses could be subpoenaed. Taehyung scrolled social media not like a spectator, but like a man holding a story key he hadn't used yet. The world thought the leak was karma punishing Jimin, but Taehyung knew karma had simply opened the curtains. The real play hadn't even begun. Karma wasn't done. Karma never is. Karma doesn't hit once, it cycles, it waits, it escalates, and it had already begun to orbit Jungkook too. Because in narratives like this, pain shared is tragedy. Pain ignored becomes evidence. Taehyung recognized the pattern, not the rumor pattern, the trauma pattern, the attachment fracture, the silent spiral, the desperation for a past that never existed outside nostalgia's creative direction. He knew the world would soon pivot toward Jungkook next, not because Jungkook lied, but because Jungkook thought withholding truth was strength instead of abandonment. And abandonment in idol narratives is always louder than betrayal. That was when Taehyung finally typed his first unsent message, not to Jimin, not to Jungkook, to himself. Silence is losing its dramatic efficiency. Truth needs a narrator now. And if neither of them will deliver it, then the hour belongs to me. because karma doesn't come for the guilty alone. Karma comes for the narrative. And Taehyung was ready to take the microphone. The world always thinks karma arrives like a punch. Loud, immediate, cinematic. But real karma, it moves like a boomerang launched in silence. And when it returns, it doesn't ask whether you were the villain or the hero. It asks whether you were honest when the cameras stopped rolling. Jungkook thought the leak was the climax. He was wrong. The leak was the intermission, the inhale before the next emotional exhale, the moment the spotlight slowly rotated because audiences never stay angry at one target for long. They need a narrative pivot, a second act, a new heartbeat to analyze. Taehyung saw it coming before the trend graphs did, not because he was psychic, but because pain has predictable seasons when left untreated. Jungkook's silence had read as strength at first, cool, stoic, controlled. But weeks of emotional embargo had turned silence into something uglier. Not mystery, not resilience, but avoidance. And avoidance is the one trait fandoms can't romanticize for long. Backstage had become his exile, the safe zone he weaponized. The award shows, the red carpets, the interviews, he executed them like choreography, precision engineered. But between schedules, he stopped answering questions that weren't asked out loud. He stopped offering concern unless prompted. He stopped being human in the places where humanity mattered most. Taehyung confronted him first, but not with shouting. Shouting had already had its era. He confronted him with contrast, with presence, with the uncomfortable mirror of observation. "You think silence makes you look unbreakable," Taehyung had said to him once in an empty studio, voice calm like an assassin wrapping a blade in velvet. "But silence is a luxury only people who haven't lost anything can afford." Jungkook didn't reply then. He simply walked out, proving the point without punctuation. Jimin heard none of that. He only felt the consequences, the unanswered texts, the unaccepted apologies, the gifts that dissolved into dorm hallways like peace offerings intercepted at customs, the emotional purgatory of being acknowledged publicly but erased privately. Jungkook had always hated being misunderstood. Ironically, silence was now making him the most misunderstood member in the building. And then karma ricocheted back toward him, exactly as Taehyung predicted, not through new leaks, but through emotional arithmetic. Because silence multiplies rumors faster than honesty kills them. Fans began recontextualizing Jungkook's behavior retroactively, not with evidence but with patterns. The sleepless nights that looked like punishment were now being read as escape. The obsessive rehearsals were being decoded not as dedication, but as substitution. The refusal to address Jimin after the leak was being reframed as guilt-adjacent cruelty. Cruelty wasn't a rumor. It was visible in his posture, in his avoidance, in the emotional distance that looked like cinematography, until someone realized it was just loneliness curated into aesthetic. Taehyung saw Jungkook standing alone again in the same studio where the apology had failed. Recording equipment blinking like a pulse monitor, mirrors reflecting a man who was unraveling in high resolution even without tears. "You think this makes you strong?" Taehyung asked him, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. Jungkook didn't answer. "Or are you scared that if you forgive him, you'll break twice as hard?" Still no answer. But his breathing changed, fractionally, and in idle narratives, a fractional breath is a confession. Taehyung stepped closer. "You didn't cry when the leak dropped. You didn't cry when he begged. So tell me, Jungkook, are you silent because you don't care anymore? Or are you silent because you care too much and don't trust the ending?" Jungkook finally exhaled, shaky, barely audible. "I don't trust him." Taehyung shook his head slowly. "No, you don't trust yourself surviving it again." That was the moment the boomerang completed its first arc. Karma wasn't punishing Jungkook for hurting Jimin. Karma was punishing Jungkook for believing silence was safer than honesty. And the story still needed one more crack before the world heard the real truth. Luckily, Taehyung had already cued the next act. And this time, The microphone wouldn't be metaphorical. It would be inevitable. The dorm was too quiet, not the gentle kind of quiet that settles after exhaustion, when laughter melts into sleep and the world feels momentarily weightless. This silence was deliberate, engineered by absence, sharp enough to slice a breath in half. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't hum, it accuses. When Jungkook returned at dawn, rain still clinging to his hoodie like a second skin, the first thing he noticed wasn't a person. It was evidence of one. Jimin's black sneakers were still by the front door, laces loose, angled carelessly, kicked off the way someone does when they believe they are finally home. Jungkook stared at them longer than was narratively comfortable. He stepped over them without touching, like stepping over a memory that still burns to look at directly. Taehyung was already awake, seated at the kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee sitting untouched beside him like a witness refusing to testify unless provoked. His gaze lifted slowly when Jungkook entered, unreadable, steady, heavy with emotional calculus. "He didn't come back," Taehyung said. Jungkook nodded once. "I know," Taehyung's jaw flexed. "You don't, because if you did, you wouldn't sound like that." Jungkook dropped his bag by the couch, exhaling sharply. "I don't need to babysit him." Taehyung laughed, one short, lethal sound. "You think this is babysitting. This is grief wearing denial. And denial is the one emotion idols aren't trained to monetize." Taehyung stepped closer, chair legs scraping softly behind him like a curtain being pulled open. "He left everything behind last night," Taehyung said, each word landing like an indictment. "His wallet, his charger, his anxiety meds." That detonated something physical. Jungkook's breath snagged midair like fabric catching on a nail. "What?" he whispered. Taehyung didn't blink. "His meds are still in the bathroom drawer, untouched." Jungkook grabbed his phone too fast, hope and dread colliding like symbols. No new notifications from Jimin, only an unknown number, a message glowing on screen like an omen. "Stop looking for him. He doesn't want to be found." Jungkook's pulse spiked. Taehyung leaned over, reading the words without permission. "Who is that?" Taehyung asked. Jungkook typed back with shaking fingers. "Who are you?" The reply came immediately. "Someone who knows what you did." Taehyung swore under his breath. "This is bad." Jungkook whispered, barely audible. "This is Jimin." "No," Taehyung said, voice low like thunder under a blanket. "And that's what scares me." Because Jungkook wasn't scared for the narrative anymore. He was scared for the person. Namjoon burst into the dorm minutes later, phone still pressed to his ear, packing like a man arguing with fate itself. "We need to call the police," he said. Jungkook shook his head. "Not yet." Taehyung stared at him like disbelief itself was a second character in the room. "Are you serious?" "If this turns public," Jungkook muttered. "It already will," Taehyung cut in, not letting him finish the sentence. "And if something happens to him because we waited." Jungkook sank onto the couch, dragging both hands down his face like he was trying to erase time. "I told him not to come back," he admitted. Hoseok, who had just entered quietly behind Namjoon, froze. "What?" Jungkook swallowed hard. "I told him if he walked out that door, don't come back." The air didn't just thicken, it weaponized gravity. Namjoon exhaled, slow, devastated. "And now?" Jungkook looked up, eyes glassy but breaking under the surface. "Now I don't know how to take it back." Another buzz, a photo this time, blurry, dark. Jimin's jacket draped over a metal chair in a building that didn't look like home, didn't look like a studio, didn't look like salvation. On the table beside it, a folded piece of paper, handwriting painfully familiar. "You pushed me." Jungkook felt the room tilt. Taehyung steadied nothing, simply watched the man unravel, because Taehyung knew this part of karma wasn't poetic justice. It was narrative recoil. Jungkook stood abruptly, jacket forgotten, breath uneven. "We're finding him now." Namjoon grabbed his keys without hesitation. Hoseok grabbed an umbrella that suddenly felt symbolic again. Taehyung followed last, but not silently. "Whatever truth comes next," he said to Jungkook before stepping outside, "you don't get to shut down anymore. Not after this." Jungkook looked at him, fear naked now. What if the truth destroys us? Taehyung answered without hesitation. Then it was already dying without honesty. The storm outside was loud. But inside Jungkook's chest, something louder had already cracked open. Regret. Not the performative kind. The human kind. And that meant the story was about to escalate again. Because idols can survive betrayal, they rarely survive regret left unspoken. If chaos had a corporate address, it would have been that office. The executive floor of HYBE was designed to feel like control, muted carpets, tempered glass, curated minimalism, the quiet luxury of a building that houses narratives instead of people. But Taehyung wasn't there for luxury. He was there because narratives had finally run out of euphemisms. When Taehyung requested a private meeting with Bang Si-hyuk, the staff didn't look surprised. They looked afraid. Fear in idol companies is rarely emotional, it's logistical. It's the fear of unpredictability, of unscripted truth, of something human contaminating something profitable. Taehyung walked into the office like a man carrying a press release written in blood, even though no wound was visible on his face. His expression was calm. The calm of a man who has already rehearsed the emotional disaster and still chooses to walk into it. Bang Si-hyuk sat across from him, leaning back in his chair like a man bracing for impact but still hoping it could be postponed. "You want to go off script," Bang said before Taehyung even spoke. "Define off script." Taehyung's stare didn't waver. No filtered interviews, no PR edits, no narrative policing, just us on camera, uncensored, unprotected, unfiltered. Bang exhaled sharply. "That's a disaster waiting to happen." "It's already a disaster," Taehyung replied. "The fans are rewriting us in real time. Rumors are doing better SEO than our silence ever did. We need to speak, not as a brand, as brothers, as men, as humans who are bleeding publicly and still expected to dance on schedule." Bang studied him for a long moment, silence flickering like a broken neon sign between them. "And what if one of you says something that kills everything?" Taehyung leaned forward slightly, a micro gesture, the kind that could rewrite economies if the moment was right. "Then at least we die telling the truth." Bang laughed once, short, controlled, but not dismissive, more like a man recognizing that honesty was no longer optional, it was inevitable. They sat in silence again, but this time it felt different, less like suffocation, more like recognition. Bang stood up, walking toward the window where rain was still streaking downward like narrative foreshadowing, refusing subtlety. "You know the company can't protect you from yourselves," Bang said quietly. "I don't want protection," Taehyung answered. "I want ownership." Bang nodded slowly. "Then understand this. Once you go live, you don't get to edit the fallout. You don't get to negotiate the narrative. You don't get to take the mic back. Are you ready for that?" Taehyung stood too. "I've been ready for weeks." They haven't, and that's why it has to be me who asks first. Because leadership in idol culture isn't about loudness. It's about who speaks when the silence stops working. Bang turned toward him fully now. "If you do this, you do it together. No scapegoats, no disappearing acts, no leaving someone to take the fall alone." Taehyung's jaw flexed once, emotion sparking dangerously close to his eyes. "I'll make sure of it," he said, "even if they hate me for it." They wouldn't hate him for it. They'd thank him for it later. Not because truth saves everyone, but because truth stops narratives from rotting in silence. 3 days after that meeting, the dorm air changed again. The crew members were preparing for a broadcast no one thought would ever be approved. No stylists, no color grading, no lighting illusions, just a camera, a table, 7 chairs, and a narrative that finally had permission to bleed honestly. Taehyung stood on the practice room floor later that night, rehearsing nothing but honesty. He imagined the ARMY comments, the trending hashtags, the RPM graphs spiking like heart monitors. He imagined the worst-case scenario and realized worst-case had already been happening quietly for weeks. The difference now, the world would finally get the unedited file. Not the rumor, not the brand, The human narrative. Taehyung wasn't nervous about going unscripted. He was nervous about how long they had waited to stop lying with silence. Because if silence was a crime, they were all accomplices. And tomorrow, the world would finally see the trial. But tonight, at least one idol executive and one idol narrator agreed on the same terrifying thesis. Truth wouldn't destroy BTS. Silence pretending to be strength would. And Taehyung had just made sure the silence didn't win by default. Live broadcasts are supposed to feel like ceremonies, controlled environments where emotions are pre-approved, where scandals are filtered through press-friendly linguistics, where truth is domesticated enough to avoid biting its owner. But this one felt less like a ceremony and more like a reckoning. Not the kind announced with thunder, but the kind announced when the room stops breathing at the same time. Taehyung arrived first, not because he wanted the spotlight, but because the spotlight was already hunting him like a heat-seeking missile looking for emotional honesty. The other members trickled in afterward, Hoseok with eyes tired but alert, Namjoon carrying a legal pad full of contingency plans he already knew would fail the moment the cameras turned on, Yoongi with that calm detachment that suggested he had emotionally processed the storm years ago, Seokjin adjusting his sleeves like armor was useless but aesthetics still mattered, and Jungkook sitting last. Always last. The man who had mistaken silence for strength was now being forced to sit beside the consequences of it. The seventh chair remained empty. Not symbolically. Physically. An emptiness on camera is louder than shouting off camera. The crew hit record, but the moment felt nothing like a beginning, more like a continuation of a truth the world had been trying to decode without the source file. Taehyung spoke first, voice steady, low, almost conversational, the cadence of a man who knows fandom retention is emotional, not informational. Before anyone asks, no, this isn't a press statement. This isn't a correction. This isn't damage control. This is us in our own words because the narrative belongs to us now. The internet would later say this was the moment the scandal peaked again. They were wrong. This was the moment the scandal became unnecessary. Because rumors die when protagonists stop letting silence speak for them. Taehyung continued. You've heard versions of this story that paint heroes and villains like we're characters in a Netflix algorithm. But the truth isn't that clean. The truth isn't color-coded. The truth is messy, interpersonal, human, and painfully ordinary in the worst possible way. Jungkook shifted beside him, jaw tightening. Not anger, anxiety. The kind that shows up when someone realizes their side of the story won't sound cinematic, it will sound culpable. Taehyung glanced toward the empty chair again, then back at the camera. Jimin and I had a fallout, not a dramatic one, not a violent one, the kind you don't write songs about, the kind that happens when two people who love each other run out of emotional bandwidth at the same time. Hoseok nodded slowly, backing him without speaking. Jungkook still said nothing. Taehyung inhaled once, a controlled breath. He apologized. I ignored it, not because I wanted revenge, but because I was exhausted, hurt, and afraid that forgiveness would cost more than resentment did. Boomerang 2 in motion. Not the punch. The confession. Namjoon finally interjected, and the truth Jungkook revealed. Taehyung smiled faintly. Oh, that part was real. Jungkook did expose something. Jungkook's eyes snapped up, ready for accusation. Taehyung shook his head. Not about Jimin, about the rest of us. The pivot hit harder than any leak ever could. Jungkook exposed our silence, Taehyung said, letting the words land like a verdict. Our inability to talk to each other honestly when we weren't being paid to talk to each other honestly. He didn't leak a secret. He leaked a symptom. Jungkook finally spoke, voice rough from disuse. I thought if I said nothing it would pass. Yoongi scoffed softly. Nothing passes, it just mutates. Seokjin sighed, rubbing his temple. The world doesn't punish idols for scandals. It punishes them for not resolving them fast enough to keep the audience emotionally fed. Taehyung nodded. And that's the karma you're seeing now, not divine justice, narrative hunger. The world was never mad about the leak. It was mad that we let silence star in the show for too long. Another notification buzzed on Jungkook's phone mid-recording. He looked at the screen and froze, not theatrically, viscerally. Taehyung leaned over without hesitation. A message from the same unknown number. He's watching. He heard everything. Now finish the story. The camera kept rolling, because the truth had just shifted from scandal to consequence. And consequence doesn't wait for commercial breaks. When the broadcast ended, nobody clapped. Nobody moved. Nobody checked the trending tags that were already exploding across the world like fireworks set off inside a library. The silence that followed wasn't fear anymore. It was the kind of quiet that only comes when something irreversible has just been spoken into existence. The unknown message had forced a final act, but the act itself wasn't spectacle. It was emotional accountability. Taehyung rose from his chair slowly, the others following his movement like synchronized instinct instead of choreography. The empty seventh chair was still there, untouched, accusing no one, forgiving no one, simply existing like a placeholder for a person who might never want to sit in a room full of truth again. Jungkook was the first to break the silence this time, ironically finding his voice only after admitting that he had once tried to bury it. "We need to stop treating honesty like a liability," he said, eyes fixed somewhere past the camera that was no longer recording, past the executives who had reluctantly approved this moment, past the fans who were already rewriting their theories in the comment sections that didn't yet exist on this video but soon would. "If we're going to fracture," Jungkook continued, "it should be because we spoke, not because we didn't." Yoongi finally stood, stretching his back like a man who had been carrying emotional furniture for years without rearranging it. "Fractures heal," he said simply. "Rot spreads." The truth had not broken BTS. Silence had almost done the job for them. Honesty had simply arrived before decomposition could finish its speech. Taehyung walked toward the studio exit next, but paused, hand resting on the frame, turning slightly toward his members. Not toward the company, not toward the audience, but toward the people who had to continue living after the narrative ended. "The world thinks karma is punishment," Taehyung said, voice low, reflective, almost philosophical now that no one was weaponizing microphones anymore. "But karma is just the echo of unfinished conversations." Hoseok exhaled with a humorless smile. "Then we've been yelling into caves for years." "No," Taehyung said, shaking his head gently. "We just finally turned the echo into dialogue." Namjoon gathered the legal pad he had brought, now useless but historically important, like a blueprint for a building that was never constructed because the real structure had been emotional, not architectural. "Fans will demand closure next," Namjoon said, already planning the narrative's next appetite. "Let them," Seokjin replied. "Closure is the only ending we owe them." Yoongi nodded. "And the only ending we owe ourselves." Jungkook stared once more at his phone, at the unknown number that had once sounded like a threat but now felt like narrative inevitability. The final message read simply, "You were honest. That's enough." Not forgiveness. Not redemption. Not resolution. Just acknowledgement. Acknowledgement is the first seed of peace. Taehyung stepped out into the hallway, members following behind him like men who had chosen honesty not because it was safe, but because the alternative had become unbearable. The dorm they returned to later that night would still be quiet, but not hostile. The kind of quiet that finally feels earned after truth has finished speaking. The cameras would return tomorrow. The schedules would continue. The world would trend again. But something had fundamentally changed in the story's backbone. They were no longer afraid of the microphone. They were no longer protected by silence. They were finally accountable to each other first. And that was the only karma that had ever mattered. The narrative didn't end with revenge. It ended with truth finally being louder than rumor. And the world could handle loud truth far better than quiet poison.